one of the true champions and pioneers in the climate space, Yvo de Boer. His bio is he's the really one of the OGs, as they say, original gangster from this space. But for those of you that are not familiar with him, Yvo, please share your journey, your history, your big purpose. What have you been doing? And also commenting on what you see. Are we getting anywhere? Are we making any progress?
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for this opportunity. You talked about OG. I always thought that meant old guy.
No, no, no. Original gangster. That's
Well, in which case, I think both apply because I first got into this topic. I mean, we're now at COP 30, right? In the multilateral process, the international process. So we've had 30 international conferences of parties to the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which started 2 years after Rio. And I got into the issue of climate change about a year before COP 1. So that tells you how much of an O I am, however way you want to use the acronym. And I came into the topic having worked on social housing before that,
oh,
in both an international context in the UN and in my home country, Holland. And when I got into climate, which was a completely new area for me, what what struck me almost immediately is that what was generally being presented as an environmental challenge was in fact an economic challenge and an economic development challenge, in the sense that the only example that we really have out there in terms of capitalist success at the national level is growing your economy through industrialization and getting a lot of associated pollution. So that's the route most of us have taken, maybe with the exception of Bhutan, and that's an example that much of the world is looking to follow. Um, my sense, looking at the world over the years, is um, well, first of all, that we seem to be preoccupied with the economies of the past rather than the economies of the future. So I think a lot of our attention is focused rightly on how can we get emissions down in industrialized countries? How can we get industrialized economies to detox from a fossil fuel oriented and a fossil fuel energy intensive society? What we're not focusing on so much is the emissions of the future. And what I mean by that is that if I look at demographics, and if I look at associated prospects for economic development, then I see that according to some projections, by the end of this century, which is not all that far away, 4 out of every 10, or 3 out of every 10, or 5 out of every 10 humans is going to be an African. So the bulk of population growth is going to happen in Africa, and probably the bulk of economic growth is going to happen in Africa and Southeast Asia. I have less of a positive feeling for what I just called the economies of the past. And my sense is that in much of the international climate debate, we're forgetting about those economies of the future. And we're forgetting to answer the question that if the only example of capitalist success we have is economic growth through industrialization, and take the associated pollution for what it is, then if that's the only success story at the national level that's out there, how can you really make a convincing case to the economies of the future for an alternative? And much of my personal involvement with the climate challenge has been around the question of how can we make that happen? Yes, how can we continue to encourage industrialized countries to bring their emissions down? And I think these annual big climate conferences are about the only opportunity that we have to put world leaders of industrialized countries, under a magnifying glass and say, what are you actually doing at home to get emissions down? And what are you doing to be a good example to the economies of the future? So the COPs are important for that. The international conferences are important for that. But I suppose my overriding question is, are we using the massive international architecture in all of its forms, shapes, and identities effectively to understand how we can work with the economies of the future to take economic growth, prosperity, poverty eradication in a different and more sustainable direction? So that's the question that I began to have 31 years ago. And sadly, it's still the question that I have today, because I have the feeling that we're still very much failing on that point. So what I did in terms of my personal journey was to start off working for the national government at a time when the second assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change had just come out. And there was a fascinating sentence in that report, which must have been written by a lawyer, not by a scientist. And the sentence was, "The balance of evidence suggests discernible human influence in terms of climate change. The balance of evidence suggests discernible human influence." And that's what politicians had to go with at that time. So a great deal of scientific uncertainty. We had the sense that something was coming our way, but was it really enough to get politicians, societies, the economy to move in a different direction? And at that time, we started, I think, with something quite sensible, which was no regret policies, to basically do stuff which we knew would be not harmful to the economy and maybe conducive in terms of addressing climate change. And we've progressed beyond that to a certain degree over the years. So I started off working on policy in a Dutch national context and trying to explain to different stakeholders why it was important to engage. And then moved on to working in a European context. By then, 80% of European decisions were being taken in Brussels, not in national capitals. So that was the place to be. And then moved on to be executive secretary for the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for a number of years. So I went sort of up, if you can call it up, a governmental and intergovernmental ladder, beginning nationally, regionally, and then the UN. And increasingly through that part of my journey, my conclusion was that the governmental stuff is undeniably important because governments and international organizations set boundary conditions. But ultimately, implementation is probably significantly down to the private sector. So are we doing enough to help the private sector to discover the business case around a different future than the one that made us successful in the past? So then I moved on to an international consulting firm, one of the big four, wanting to work with the private sector, but not with an individual company. And at that time, we had teams, I think, in about 50 countries, working exclusively with corporates around the question of what can we do to make the business case for sustainable development, and what can we do to make the business case for climate action. And at that time, we produced a report. It's dated now. It's from 2010, but I don't think it's less relevant. It was under the title, "Expect the Unexpected, Building Business Value in a Changing World." And what we did in that report was look at a number of global trends that were and are coming our way around climate, energy prices, energy security, food scarcity, water scarcity, biodiversity loss, material scarcity, quite a lengthy list. And then in the second section, ask ourselves the question, what would that potentially mean, those global trends, for the business model of a number of different sectors in the global economy? So cement, steel, pulp and paper, transport, textiles, etc. And the third part focused on, if those trends are coming our way, and if those trends are likely to have an impact on successful business models, then what are the risks and opportunities we should be thinking about? In terms of risk, what is the legal risk, the financial risk, the insurance risk that might be coming our way? And how can we cope with those risks, not by resisting them, but by focusing on opportunities, by creating business models that build value in a society that recognizes where the planet is going. And that thought from the private sector took me to one of the last stages in my career. I may be an OG, but I'm not over and gone. Um, I worked for a knowledge institution called the Global Green Growth Institute, which is based in Korea. It's a knowledge-based institution. At the time, we had teams in about 25 emerging economies. It's now grown to 50. And what I would basically do is walk into the office, or try to walk into the office of the head of a national planning commission in the UAE, in Indonesia, in Mauritania, you name it. Walk into the office of the head of the National Planning Commission and say, wow, you've got this wonderful 5-year plan. How would you like me and my colleagues to give you something that shows a stronger economic growth, but with greater job creation and lower environmental pressure? And that's pretty tough to say no to. So that
Sure.
was a good way of getting into the door. But I think at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. It's for me, yes, it's important to try and persuade the skeptics. Yes, it's important to emphasize why climate action and sustainability are important. But at the end of the day, if you don't manage to demonstrate to people why this is critical to them and how acting on what they see happening around them can actually be an opportunity for the future, that for me is the pathway to success. And then to get almost to the end of this rather long ramble,
Yeah.
if you ask yourself the question, well, that's interesting, but is that realistic? Then I think back to not all that long ago to what we called Corona in this country, not a Mexican beer, but COVID-19, and all of the fantastic business models that emerged in response to that crisis. I suddenly saw all kinds of people in all corners of society and the economy putting on their innovation hats and thinking, well, if this disease is reshaping our realities, how can we turn that to a societal and a personal advantage? So I think at the end of the day, um, I don't remember who it was that said to me, if you can't make the business case, you might as well stop talking.
Mm.
That at the end of the day, whether it's a business case for a family, for a city, for a region, for a country, or an international organization, it's about making the business case that allows you to keep talking and allows you to convince. I'll stop there.
I totally agree with you because I always felt, shouting loudly in a different language to the business community is not going to get through to them. And they should have shifted far more toward resilience rather than sacrifice, because sacrifice corporates don't like to sacrifice. Then you don't get their attention. So focusing on the business case, but you approach it from many, many different angles from the EU, from the Dutch government, from KPMG, from a global association in Korea. Which one, gave you the most fulfillment doing that? Because you were approaching many different ways, and maybe that progressed to lead you to where you are now, that this is the most effective way. Which one do you think was the most effective in getting fundamental change toward addressing the climate challenge?
Well, you've asked the question twice, I think in two slightly different ways. I think the first time you asked me about which one gave me the most satisfaction,
Mm,
and the second time, I think you asked me which one had the most success.
okay.
Um, I think the one that gave me the most satisfaction was this institute in Korea, the Global Green
Oh,
Growth Institute, because um, I've always, maybe I'm naive, but I've always felt that the people responsible for deforestation don't cut down trees because they think they're ugly,
no.
but because they think it's to their advantage to cut them down, to greater
True.
advantage than leaving them standing. And similarly, I think that with one or two notable exceptions, um, the bulk of humanity, if you can call the exceptions humanity, um, are not against sustainability and are not against taking growth in a different direction. And I think even the root of conservatism is in preserving what's good and not setting it aside. So my sense is that there's a saying that where there is a will, there is a way.
Hmm.
And I've have the strong feeling that we need to turn that around and say that where there is a will, there is a way. What I mean by that is that I think many countries would love to engage, and many companies and many societies and many regions would love to engage on a different way forward. Um, so the will is there, but they don't always see the way. And I saw the most satisfaction then in helping to find the way, saying this is not about being a missionary. This is about finding a success story for you that you believe in, a path that you're interested in following. So in that sense, that was the period that gave me the most satisfaction. The success, unfortunately, is lacking in very much of my professional life.
Depends on how you measure success.
That's true.
And so, but you've seen from all, you've been to very many comps. You were at, one of the first ones where the whole, sense of urgency was trying to be pushed there, and a greater sense of urgency. Then the last one, everyone's disappointed. The oil and gas sector were able to lobby and stop. What do you think would be the most effective way to speed up adaptation to decarbonization? Is it tax? Is it cap and share? Everyone getting a carbon allowance. I heard an interesting model for Switzerland where they want to, or at least one guy is working with the government of trying to convince them to put a border tax and a tax inside, kind of a tariff on CO2 emissions, but that instead of it going to the government, it would be equally divided among all the citizens of Switzerland. So it's an extra income there. You've probably seen hundreds of solutions. So next year, the airline industry has to try to offset um, their emissions. What do you think is the quickest? What would be the most effective?
Um, I don't know if there's a counter personality to Robin Hood, but I I've never seen a finance ministry in the world that is willing uh, to get tax revenues and then to give them away. So I I, I think that's a difficult one. But ask me what the main thing is that I learned from the multilateral process, the UN
Mhm.
process, and it's something strange. It's what I learned is that if you want to solve a problem, you need to make it bigger, not smaller. And what I mean by that is that if you look at who's around the table in the UN negotiations, um, it's 197 countries, or at least it was until Uncle Donald came along. Now it's 196. But they're very different people and very
Right.
different places. There's small island states that are disappearing. There are countries like Saudi Arabia, which quite legitimately would like to continue earning money from oil and gas.
Mhm.
Countries like Poland, which I think still have 90 something percent coal in their energy mix. agricultural nations, you name it. They're all those tribes are around the table. And you're never going to be able to find a total solution that's suitable to everyone.
Mm,
You need to make sure that you create slices of the pie or of the pizza, an agriculture pizza slice and an oil and gas pizza slice and a disappearing island pizza slice that gives every one of their players something that satisfies their particular national or economic or regional interest to such a degree that they say, well, what you're offering me in my slice is good enough for me to accept all of the other slices as well, which may be less attractive. So that's what I take from that. And the deeper message for me is that finding solutions needs to be situation specific and specific to an understanding of the problem or the challenge or the question that we're talking about. So I don't think there is a universal solution, a magic bullet that we can apply around the world. I think we very much need to look at the national, regional, and local circumstances that apply in a particular situation. I was reading something not all that long ago that the Chinese are having huge success
yeah.
selling solar panels into Africa.
Mm.
And they're hugely successful there because the formal grid, the formal energy system is failing, and people can't do it without energy. So they're moving to these Chinese solar panels. I don't think that's the solution, but I do think, well, I don't think that's the entire solution, but I do think it's important to look at an understanding of national, local, and regional circumstances, and to say, well, how can I build a really attractive business case for you, whether it's a business case from a government perspective or a private sector perspective or whatever, a business case that you say, yes, I would like to engage on that. I believe on that. And then the second question for me is to say, okay, well, then what are the barriers? What do we need to address, which are specific? And then the third question, which we miserably fail to address in an integrated context, is what do we actually have in the toolbox to help? You know, um, we have the International Monetary Fund. And I remember years ago, I think probably close to 30 years ago, going to speak to the boss of the IMF and saying, could you integrate climate into your lending policies? And the answer was yes, providing the World Bank helps us to understand how we can do that in a meaningful way. So that's the IMF and the World Bank. And then you've got the UN, which has got no money, but lots of knowledge. You've got
Yeah.
institutions like UNDP, people coming at international development or development in general from an economic perspective or a trade perspective or a health perspective or almost you name it. So are we really using the toolboxes of the IMF, the World Bank, the UN system in an integrated way? So that's part of a toolbox that can be incredibly useful in terms um, of helping to understand barriers. What I take in to really be simplistic now, from my experience with business, is that there are three things that you need to think about, and those three things are risk, rate of return, and size of market.
Mhm.
Those three things to really oversimplify at the end of the day, decide if the business community does something or doesn't do something. So then the question for me is how can you apply that incredible international toolbox to the questions of risk, rate and return, and size of market to deliver tailor-made solutions that are relevant to a country, a region, or a city with very specific circumstances.
I don't know if it's true. I kept reading that the energy sector, the oil and gas sector, particularly companies like Exxon, were in favor of a carbon tax because they felt, well, it impacts everybody in the oil and gas sector. So it's not only going to penalize us, that is something that we could live with. But every time COP comes along, it's the oil and gas sector that kept saying, well, let's not phase out fossil fuels. So which one is true? Do they really want a carbon tax, or is it just for show?
Well, there's been a lot of talk. Um, I don't fully understand it, but there's been a lot of talk in the UN system about a just transition, which I understand from a moral and a human perspective. Um, but then I look back in history and ask myself the question, can I find examples of just transitions? And the only rather cynical one that I can come up with is that the British government a long time ago paid off the slave traders
Mm,
to get them to stop. So that I think is an example, a rather cynical example of a just transition.
mm,
But I don't think that when we discovered bronze, I don't think there was a compensation mechanism for the stone arrowhead makers. And similarly, when the Industrial Revolution came along, that was good for some, but bad for many. At the end of the day, what all of that shows for me, or shows me, is that we will transition when we find something that's more attractive, and we will transition when we find something that's more affordable, more economical, and that has multiple advantages. The the drawback of a carbon tax from an oil and gas company perspective is that you raise the price of fossil fuels.
yeah.
So what you're doing is you're drawing renewables into the market.
Mm,
And thanks to an incredibly unlevel international playing field, all of the subsidies for oil and gas and everything else, renewables are having a really tough time still making it into the market. Although they're beginning to make it through the cracks in a very significant way. So I understand why people on the fossil fuel side of things are against um, a global carbon price, because it helps to bring us closer to a level playing field. What I understand less is that, while I really believe in the need to address climate change, I don't so much believe in a world that is no longer reliable on any form of fossil fuel byproduct or whatever. So I wonder if they're worried about the right question.
Believe it or not, in a previous life, I worked on oil rigs in Iran, in the North Sea, in France, and Southwest. I did that for a couple of years, so I know what it is to make a hole in the ground. What surprised me that there were not more accidents like Deepwater Horizon, because I met a lot of incompetent people working on these
Hmm.
places. But then I saw that it's easy for all of them to make their targets just by doing this for the pipeline, just, opening up the flow, we can hit our targets. But at the same time, if you want to do a decarbonization of energy and you have Tornado Alley in the US, Nebraska, Kansas, all those places, who do you want building, rolling out millions of solar panels and hundreds of thousands of wind turbines? You want a big company like an ExxonMobil to do that. But they've not, BP rebranded Beyond Petroleum, but they have not really embraced that idea using the story, well, it's going to be so much transition in infrastructure. And I kept thinking, in the 1800s, there were no gas stations around. There were no refineries around. All of that had to be built. So you can
Yeah.
also do that, but it doesn't seem to resonate with them.
Well, I'm Dutch.
Yeah.
So and you've heard of Dutch disease.
Yeah.
Um, in the 1960s and afterwards, our economy was so dependent on natural gas revenue um, that it became very problematic because the gas wasn't endless. And what we did, pretty much like what the Norwegians are doing now, was to use that revenue to diversify our economy. Um, and I think I remember people in the UAE saying to me, today we account for 10% of global energy from oil and gas.
Mhm.
In the future, we want to own 10% of the global energy sector, but in an economy that's future fit. So I do think there are people, countries and companies that think about how can we use today's wealth to make ourselves future fit, to diversify. I think part of the problem is that many of the people in the oil and gas sector seem to be one-trick ponies, that they're not all that good at diversifying and doing different stuff.
No.
What really amazed me when I spent time in Korea was that you get companies like LG or Hyundai,
Mhm.
and you think they're good at something that you know them for. But when you live in the country, you see that they also make toothbrushes and they own hospitals, and
Yeah.
they're hugely diversified. And I think by and large, oil and gas is not all that good at diversifying.
Mhm.
I think BP has tried under charismatic leadership, but that went away again. That Shell has tried to diversify into renewables, but I don't know if it was coming from the head or the heart or some other organ in the body, but that didn't really work either. So my experience is that they're not terribly good at that.
And right after World War II, an agreement was made by all of the global powers in the aviation industry that we won't have a sales tax on airline tickets and we won't have a tax on kerosene. The situation now is you buy a bicycle in Europe, it's usually 21 to 25% sales tax. You buy an airline ticket, there's no sales tax in that. But even after that, after all of these years, even that simple thing, which seems simple, has not been changed. And it's massively subsidized the airline, and most of them don't make money on that because, if you're running for office, the last thing you want to do is say, sorry, we're going to start charging sales tax and kerosene tax on airlines. And by the way, vote for me. You're not going to be able to travel with EasyJet for 10 euro to Lisbon from London. Um, doesn't it get you very, I mean, you've been at the coal phase for so long. Doesn't it get you very frustrated about the inertia of trying to get something changed? You said the toolkit and understand the different the pizza pie division, but at the same time, things, go incredibly slow when the climate damage or risk is only accelerating, or we just seem to be running out of runway.
Yeah. Um, well, to stay positive, um, I think it's wonderful the way in which um, obstacles and setbacks stimulate human ingenuity.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is that um, climate action is a hard sell in many countries of the world. People think it's really important; they just don't want to pay for it. And it's incredible to see how governments have managed to find ways around that obstacle by basically, well, many countries, certainly mine, by integrating climate-friendly measures into almost every aspect of government policy. So that you won't be hit directly with a price increase, but you'll be hit with VAT differentiation or lots of other measures to still try and get you and your behavior to the desired point. So in that sense, I think there's ingenuity. Yes, I'm disappointed by the lack of progress on things like the airlines. But there, I also see some movement. I see ICAO or the airline companies under ICAO or agreeing to a market-based mechanism, which you can ask a lot of questions on, well, if an airline emits a ton less but buys an emission reduction of a ton somewhere else, how does that help? Well, at least it helps in the way that they had to pay for that 1 ton that they bought. And that's going to have an impact on their costs and an impact on the price of an airline ticket for a traveler and the choice that the traveler makes. Um, you probably know that I come from a country that's divided by some major rivers, north and south,
Yeah.
and the people that live south of those rivers are generally Catholic, and the people that live north of those rivers are generally Protestant. I'm
True.
sort of
Yeah.
generalizing at the moment.
Hmm.
Um, Although I live on the north, I don't really take a Protestant or Calvinist approach to life. I believe that everyone, including you, should be allowed to do what they want, providing you clean up your own mess instead of passing it on to me.
Right.
So for me, it's not about saying you have to become a vegetarian or you have to, get rid of the SUV or never go on holiday. As far as I'm concerned, you can do it all, providing you pick up the cost of that. So I think part of the solution, on the one hand, it's very much about designing the successful business models that I talked about or discovering those. On the other hand, it's about confronting people with the broader cost of the choices that they choose to make. So don't call the choice into question, but just say be a good citizen and pay for your own sins.
There's been a lot of money pouring into what so-called climate tech funds. I think the last figure I saw was about 80 billion. Unfortunately, when I, started to really look at them, most of them just seem unicorn chasers. They're not really impacting climate in the short term. Like
Hmm.
Climeworks of sucking CO2 out of the air raised over $1 billion for their machine in Switzerland and in Iceland. And they admitted that it produces more CO2 than they draw down. But that will do an IPO. They will do an IPO. They will get 10x return for their investors, but they're not impacting climate in the short term. Whereas nature-based solutions, or as Professor Rotala talks about, of restoring the health of soil and vegetation and the ocean, is a cheaper, faster, but there's no IPO, which is why the money goes into climate tech, but it's not addressing climate. I always tell them change it to your title to a unicorn chaser, because that's really what it is. What is there anything that can be done to kind of put a value on nature to get people to want to address and restore the health of the soil? Because the potential for carbon drawdown is quite substantial there.
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think there are. You were talking a while back. I don't know if it was before you switched on the record button or after, but you were talking about working with the insurance
Oh
industry,
yeah, the Dutch insurance industry.
and their lack of willingness to perceive risk that is
Yeah.
very real.
Mhm.
I, I think just to go back to the pie or the pizza, I think there are multiple answers to this question. I think one is um, to really explain the risk associated with doing nothing. So to make the risk and the cost associated with that risk real. and that can take you into a whole set of solutions that are important. Um, Secondly, there are business cases around um, the recognition of changes in the value chain and changes in supply. Um, for example, I remember in the business part of my life sitting down with people who make chocolate, and I'm a
Yeah.
great chocolate lover,
Me
and
too.
saying to them, do you realize that where you can actually grow cocoa beans is going to change
Yeah.
um, because of climate change? And it might change out of a band that's suitable and fertile, but into a band that's suitable but not fertile.
Mm.
And how are you going to be prepared for that? Um, I remember talking to consumer goods companies and saying, we have a food and a water and a materials crisis on our doorstep around the world. Um, how are you integrating that into business models that can survive? So the first slice of the pie is risk perception and understanding of risk. The second perception um, is building business models that can be successful under changed circumstances. And then finally, but not finally, because the problem is more complex. It's about certain things around which you will never be able to make a business case in an individual context, but where there is a global human interest at stake. Um, and yes, maybe part of the reason why the US was interested in addressing the hole in the ozone layer is because Californian babes were burning on the beach. It was also because of a recognition of a really massive global challenge.
Mm.
So I think we need to recognize that intelligently operating multilateral institutions need to be part of the solutions in difficult contexts where a business solution can't make it or a business solution can't make it on its own.
Well, I'm one of the weirdos that was never a fan of EVs. I just saw all of this money pouring into EVs, and then I started to research, well, how much are cars used? And I was shocked to see that the average distance worldwide was like 40 kilometers daily. And in the US, half the trips are less than 10 kilometers, and they're parked 80 to 90% of the day. So all of this infrastructure, all of this mining of digging out materials and rubber and blowing glass and all that and making steel, all of that for a vehicle that is hardly used, parked most of the time, and all of the infrastructure of the city when public transport on demand, kind of like imagine a kind of Uber lit minivan where it comes around, picks you up, and takes other people. But as a public transport system, it's just much wiser way. But again, no 10x, at least
Mhm.
that. So sometimes what seems like, oh, EVs are fantastic, they're going to decarbonize the whole transportation system. When I seem to have been able to manage for 10 or 15 years without any, maybe longer without a car, living in Amsterdam. But I'm definitely, kind of shouting in the desert about that. And public transport is just so much more efficient and easy to get. If, just look at Hong Kong or Singapore or Japan. We're in Japan now. It's just much, much, much more efficient. But again, it's that 10x chasing on top of the fact that there's 5 times more wealth than global GDP. So there's close to $5 or euro chasing 1 euro. So there's lots of money, but it seems that it seems to be never enough. So I understand the business case, but sometimes the obsession of the business case becomes ridiculous. That it's making money off of planetary destruction makes you a drug dealer,
Hmm.
like the Sacklers in OxyContin.
Yeah. Um,
Sorry to be so
well,
blunt.
no, that's fine. I think we both, I, I think we agree that um, if you can make money to bring about something that's right rather than something that's wrong, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. Um, to to get a bit down a bit deeper to what you were saying, um, I would love to live in the countryside,
Hmm.
and my wife says I don't want to move to the countryside. I want to live in a city.
Yeah,
I want theaters. I want concert halls. I want cinemas. And then I say to my wife, but darling, how often in a year do we
yeah,
go to the theater or concert or the cinema? Maybe once, maybe twice,
yeah.
maybe three times, maybe four. But
Mm,
do we? Maybe we can just get rid of all the theaters and the concert halls and the cinemas because nobody actually ever, hardly ever uses them.
mm,
When my father retired, he said, I'm not going to take a car anymore. I figured out that I can spend 400 euros a month on taking taxis rather than
yeah.
having a car. Now he's Dutch and probably was a Protestant, but so what he did was he didn't take the car, but he never took a taxi either. So, um, what I'm trying to say is that people like to have the choices, even though the choices might not make rational
Mm,
sense. And if people want to make irrational choices, and here I get back to the EVs. If people want to make irrational choices, they desperately need to have this can standing outside their front door.
right.
Um, let's see how we can make it, from a societal point of view, the best possible can.
The I know your background is very much in social sciences. Correct me if I'm wrong. Do you have any? Have you seen any research around? I don't really believe it's geoengineering, but people are calling it geoengineering. Something called marine cloud brightening of use spraying the attached to a ship, spraying into the air droplets of seawater into the air, which reflect the sun to lower the temperature. In theory, I keep hearing that you're able to turn it on and off almost digitally, that it's not permanent, and you can lower the temperature. Have you seen any research on that approach where people feel we're really running out of runway and we need to find kind of unusual solutions for climate?
Yeah, I think we're back to your unicorn chases a bit now. Um, I haven't seen research, haven't read research on it, basically because I can't be bothered to read it. But I've seen stories about it. Um, I personally I think we need to come to grips with the core causes of this problem, not with the symptoms of the disease. So a lot of this geoengineering, I don't think is, it's a way to spend a lot of money to address an issue, in this case, climate change. But I think at a global level, if you look at the cost of that, it's not going to be more attractive than moving away from a fossil fuel based economy.
Mhm.
On the contrary, that people will probably start taxing the fossil fuel producers in order to pay for the ships that are going to spray the seawater into the cloud. So people might be shooting themselves in their own foot. Um, I remember, and you'll remember as well, that when the catalytic converters were invented, um, lots of people said, great, now we have catalytic converters that'll take carbon monoxide out of the air, and it's going to be much healthier. And there were other people, more north of the river people, who said this should be about bringing driving down. This shouldn't be about bringing emissions down. Um, so that's a very circumvent way of saying that I've read about these solutions to some extent. I think they evade the causes of the problem. And at the end of the day, I think they might actually, in a perverse way, bring the real solutions into the market as opposed to pricing them out of the market.
Are you familiar with now in the US with AI, everybody is building these massive data centers. So there's lots of money building data centers, some off grid, some on grid. The grid can't handle that amount. It uses a lot of power. But one of the companies that contacted us was also generating green ammonia in the production, but on a large scale. But I didn't know that data centers are often burning fuel for backup power in case they can never go down. And
Hmm.
this company produces a large amount of green ammonia, but only 5% or 10% of it is used, and the rest is for shipping or other forms. Is that an a positive development in climate to switch ships to green ammonia? Because I understand you need 2 or 3 times as much green ammonia as compared to bunker fuel as you do now because of the density of the energy.
Hmm. No idea.
Okay, all right. Um, I promised you that I would keep this to 60 minutes. How can we help you? Those that are listening will listen, and us, TBLI itself.
Yeah. Um, I think it goes back to understanding the pizza or understanding the cake. I think it's really developing, assuming that most humans are good,
Hmm.
assuming that most people would like to address climate change, assuming that people would like a healthy economic future that's planet compatible. Although I think the planet would rather be rid of us than continue to have us around. But anyway, climate compatible. I think, I've been in so many countries, regions, and cities where people would love to do things differently, but they don't really understand how. So, really developing um, a deeper understanding of barriers, how barriers can be addressed, and how we can mobilize the existing toolbox to address those barriers. Um, what I see is an awful lot of compartmentalization.
Hmm.
That there are institutions that develop roadmaps and sector-specific models for decarbonization. Um, but I don't so often see how those kinds of solutions are applied in a local context to address barriers and bring solutions. So I think, different birds of a feather working together to find situation specific solutions. Um, that's that's helpful. So maybe we almost need a kind of, you used to have this thing you probably traveled a lot in Europe on twinning. You have
Hmm.
it in Japan as well, where you walk into some Japanese village and you see that they're twinned with some obscure village in Greece that you've never heard
Right.
about. Um, and you wonder, what do they get out of this?
Yeah.
Um, but maybe we need more of a twinning more of a twinning context whereby a village can reach out to you or to a network and say, look, this is what I would like to achieve. Help me understand the problems that I have and how I can fix them.
Hmm. I admire the fact that you, despite all of the challenges and working at this for over 30 years or longer, that you still remain calm. Although I was quite happy and surprised by your critical post about Wopke Hoekstra, about what he didn't do before, and now he's trying to be the superhero of climate. Uh,
Yeah.
how do you maintain that, that things are as they are? Let's see if we can nudge things along, slowly and understand that everyone has different interests, and getting people around the table with a collective interest is not easy.
Well, I think at the end of the day, cynicism and depression don't get you anywhere.
Mm,
Um, what I think got me angry about what I see happen in the European Commission
mm,
or in Europe is that I think it's the responsibility of an EU climate commissioner to be as ambitious as possible on climate action, and then make that work to the degree feasible, um, from the perspective of those that you have to convince, that you have to get them, that you have to get on board. Um, I don't think it's the responsibility. I'm not saying that they're doing this or that they're doing it entirely, but it's the responsibility of a climate commissioner, um, to think from the perspectives of the interests that a trade commissioner or an agricultural commissioner or a transport commissioner should be thinking about. So I think you need to fight from your corner of the ring, not from everybody else's.
Thank you so much for taking the time, and also for the heavy lifting that you've been doing all these years. It's a maybe a labor of love or hate, but it's also very, very heavy lifting with not much applause for the work that you're doing. Only, people love to cut ribbons and say that, but they forget about the people who have to dig the holes to get to the
Mhm.
ribbon cutting ceremony. So thank you so much for doing that. I'm going to stop this.